Most people describe coffee by its flavor notes. A Roastmaster reads coffee differently. We look for structure, balance, and how the cup moves. Once you start tasting that way, flavor notes start to mean something completely different. Usually, when we taste coffee, we start by naming what we recognize: chocolate, fruit, nuts. That's a natural way to describe something we enjoy. But tasting through Roastmaster's eyes is different. It's not so much about what flavors appear, but it's more about how the cup behaves. You start noticing movements, how flavor rise, settle, and fade. Balance becomes less about equal parts and more about how those changes feel in sequence. Clarity, body, aftertaste. They are not separate. They build on each other, shaping how the cup carries itself from start to finish. Sometimes the first sip feels sharp and open, then softens halfway through and leaves a calm finish. Other times the cup stays tight. You can feel tension that never quite resolves. Reading flavor means paying attention to that movement, not judging it as good or bad, just seeing what the coffee is showing you. That's where tasting becomes observation, how structure, balance, and timing reveals coffee's character beyond flavor notes. When I taste coffee, I'm not just tasting the cup in front of me. I'm tracing it back to how it was roasted. Every small decision that built what I'm drinking now. Everything in the cup reflects that process. Aftertaste often shows how deeply the heat reached inside the beans. When there is a lingering sour edge, the core probably didn't develop enough. When I sense smokiness, I think about airflow. Maybe it was too weak in the later stage, letting smoke stay and mark the flavor. Body shows how heat control shifted over time. If beans that should have a strong body taste flat, the momentum slipped somewhere and the body got lost. If the cup feels heavy and rounded as expected, heat likely rose and stayed just long enough to bring out depth while keeping weight. Acidity changes most through roasting. Unpleasant acidity usually means underdevelopment. But depending on the roast path, some acidity shows up as young or ripe. Faster development or slower development can shift that character. All of these impressions ties back to the same thing. Not just numbers or data, but how heat, air, and time were handled. That's what the Roastmaster reads in the cup. The memory of the roast speaking through flavor. When I roast, I don't start with numbers. I start by watching how they behave. The sound, the smell, the way they move in the drum. Every batch feels a little different, even when everything looks the same on paper. I learned that from watching my parents roast. They didn't explain things with curves or targets. You watch, you try. Tough love. Asian parents. Occasionally, they'd say something like, "No more steam coming out," pointing a small opening of a manual drum. And I'd have to interpret what that meant. It was their way of saying, the moisture's out, the beans are now in the real roasting phase. Well, of course, I didn't understand that first. But over time, I began to hear what they meant. Not just in words, but in how the beans sounded and smelled. That's how I learned to pay attention. In Japan, craftsmanship has a lot to do with repetition and observation. You do the same motion again and again until it becomes instinct. That mindset shaped how I roast. Quietly watching, adjusting, remembering how each bean responds. It's not a system, it's awareness. When you repeat something long time, instinct replaces calculation. You start trusting what you sense, not just what the data tells you. That's why I value control. When you can control what happens in roasting or brewing, you can finally listen to what the coffee is trying to say. If you watched my previous video about control, this is where it leads. The control gives you the space to read the cup. I hope this way of thinking about coffee connects with you. Everything I share comes from years of living this craft. So if that resonates, subscribing is a good way to stay connected. You don't have to be a Roastmaster to start reading flavor. Simply noticing what you taste is already a great start. When you write down notes like chocolate, fruit, nuts, that's paying attention. And that attention builds awareness. Once that becomes natural, try adding one more layer. Instead of stopping at what you taste, notice how those flavors connect. Do they feel balanced? Does something linger or fade too quickly? That awareness deepens your relationship with the coffee you already enjoy. You can try this with your usual beans, the ones you already know well. The more familiar the coffee, the easier it is to sense small differences. You don't need to see the roasting path behind it. You can still taste the result in the cup. It takes time and a repetition to build that kind of palate. But once your senses open up, you naturally start exploring how flavors work together. That's where coffee pairing comes in. Taking those same skills and applying them to food. It's for people who want to experience coffee on another level, where curiosity and taste come together. When you start tasting coffee this way, you realize flavor isn't just something to describe. It's something to understand. Every part of the cup tells a story. How it was roasted, how it was brewed, and how it holds itself together. You don't need to be a professional to sense it. You just need curiosity and a little patience to let your senses catch up. That's how I read coffee flavor. As a second-generation Japanese Roastmaster, by listening to what the coffee is saying. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful coffee day.